Benjamin once had a brother, Abidemi, who was quiet and introverted by nature. Abidemi was the type of person who could live in silence for months, speaking only to Benjamin and no one else. His calm and meek disposition made him a peculiar presence in their chaotic home. He avoided arguments, bore insults with grace, and faithfully completed all his household chores without a single word of complaint. Their father loved Abidemi for this, perhaps even favored him above everyone else in the family. Yet this love was not extended to Benjamin. Their father despised Benjamin, constantly reminding him that he was unwanted and unworthy of his attention. When their mother divorced their father, life took a dramatic turn. She took all their sisters with her, leaving Benjamin and Abidemi behind. Her decision wasn't fueled by favoritism. She claimed it was for their education. But that decision left the two brothers stranded in a house that grew darker with each passing day. Their father, unable to live without the company of a woman, remarried almost immediately. His new wife brought 3 children from 3 different men, and from the moment she entered their lives, she became an instrument of misery. Their stepmother wasted no time in establishing her dominance. She treated her children like royalty, ensuring they were well-fed and clothed, while Benjamin and Abidemi were left to fend for themselves. Their father, who once held power in the household, turned a blind eye to her cruelty. It was as though he had relinquished all responsibility for them. At the tender age of 10, their father delivered a crushing blow. He announced he would no longer finance Benjamin's education. He washed his hands of Benjamin, declaring that he was on his own. This declaration plunged Benjamin into a life of extreme poverty. He became the poorest student in his primary school, unable to afford even the simplest necessities. He missed tests because he lacked the money to buy 2A and 2B exercise books. His school uniform consisted of a single t-shirt, worn repeatedly, washed at night and worn damp in the mornings. Benjamin remembered the stares, the whispers, and the shame that accompanied his poverty. Their father's other children, born of his many wives, lived lives of relative comfort. He spent lavishly on them, ensuring they had everything they needed. Benjamin and Abidemi, however, were left to suffer. It was a painful divide, made worse by the fact that they were constantly reminded of their exclusion. Abidemi, ever the dutiful one, decided to take matters into his own hands. He sought a way to contribute, to lighten their burdens in whatever small way he could. Abidemi decided to learn a trade. With the help of their eldest brother, he was apprenticed to a furniture maker. It was a step toward independence. While Abidemi worked to build a future, Benjamin was left to navigate the harsh realities of their home. He took on menial jobs, washing dishes in a local canteen just to earn enough to buy clothes. At one point, Benjamin had an opportunity to sit for a scholarship exam. It felt like a lifeline, a chance to escape the cycle of poverty and neglect. But even that hope was dashed. Forces within their family worked against him, diverting and sabotaging his chance at a better future. Benjamin's brother Abidemi faced a difficult journey during his apprenticeship. Their stepmother, emboldened by their father's indifference, directed her cruelty toward Abidemi. After long days of learning and labor, Abidemi would return home only to find no food waiting for him. Night after night, he endured hunger, while their father, who had once shown him favoritism, remained silent. Meanwhile, their stepmother ensured her own children were well-fed and pampered, with their education fully funded. Starving and desperate, Abidemi sought help from strangers. He found a woman in the neighborhood who sold rice and struck a deal with her. In exchange for fetching water and filling her drums, she provided him with a plate of food. Though it was a small relief, it wasn't enough to sustain him. At night, he took on additional work, washing a neighbor's taxi for a meager 50 cents. It was hard and thankless, but it kept him going. These survival efforts introduced Abidemi to a new circle of acquaintances. The taxi owner and his friends, who were habitual weed smokers, welcomed Abidemi into their group, offering him companionship in exchange for his labor. It was the start of a dangerous descent, though neither Benjamin nor Abidemi realized it at the time. As Benjamin observed Abidemi's suffering, he felt a mix of helplessness and anger. Too young to fight the battles that needed fighting, Benjamin's attempts to confront their stepmother and father were met with indifference or hostility. Despite everything, Abidemi remained calm, never raising his voice or complaining. But Benjamin could see the toll it was taking on him. The light in Abidemi's eyes began to dim, replaced by a weariness Benjamin couldn't ignore. The story of Benjamin and Abidemi was one of survival against all odds. It was a tale of two brothers navigating a world seemingly determined to break them. Abidemi, with his quiet resilience, bore the brunt of the household's cruelty, while Benjamin, with his fiery spirit, fought against it in whatever ways he could. Together they faced a divided home, each day a new struggle, each moment a test of their endurance. Life at home felt like one of those scary stories people tell to send shivers down your spine. Abidemi was the quiet one, never complaining, but Benjamin could tell he was tired and sad all the time. Though only a few years older, Abidemi seemed to carry the weight of the world on his shoulders. Each day he woke up early, fetched water, and went to his apprenticeship. When he returned home, he sat silently in the corner, his stomach growling from hunger. Benjamin tried to help but was just a child. He remembered once asking their stepmother why she didn't feed Abidemi. She glared at him and told him to mind his own business. "He's old enough to take care of himself," she said. But Benjamin knew Abidemi wasn't old enough. He was just a teenager, barely 15, already treated like an outsider in his own home. Abidemi sometimes fetched water for the women who sold rice on the street. In return, they would give him a plate of soup or rice. He also started washing a taxi for a man in the neighborhood, as usual. The man paid him 50 cents each night, a small amount, but it was better than nothing. But there was something strange about the taxi man. He and his friends always sat around smoking funny-smelling cigarettes. Abidemi would sit with them after washing the taxi. He didn't smoke at first, but Benjamin noticed he started coming home smelling like the same strange smoke. Benjamin didn't know much about it then, but he knew it wasn't good. One night, Benjamin saw Abidemi sitting with the taxi man and his friends. They were laughing loudly and talking about things Benjamin didn't understand. Abidemi looked different. His eyes were distant, like he was there but not really there. Benjamin called out to him, "Brother, come home." But Abidemi waved him off and told him to leave him alone. Benjamin felt tears well up in his eyes, because he didn't recognize his brother anymore. Abidemi wasn't his quiet, hard-working brother. He was changing, and it scared Benjamin. At home, things were getting worse. Their stepmother seemed to enjoy making them miserable. She'd cook big meals for her children and leave nothing for Benjamin and Abidemi. Sometimes Benjamin would sneak into the kitchen to grab leftovers, but she'd catch him and yell. Their father didn't say anything, he just sat there, watching everything as though it didn't matter. One day, Benjamin tried to talk to their father about Abidemi. "Papa," he said, "why does stepmother treat us like this? Why don't you stop her?" Their father looked at him with cold eyes and said, "You're lucky I let you stay in this house. If you don't like it, you can leave." His words felt like a slap in the face. Benjamin ran outside and cried under the mango tree, wishing he could disappear. Abidemi started acting stranger by the day. He talked to himself sometimes, saying things that didn't make sense. "They're watching me," he'd whisper, even when no one was around. Benjamin didn't understand what was happening to him, but he knew it wasn't good. He tried to talk to him, but Abidemi would just smile and say, "Don't worry about me, little one. I'll be fine." One evening, Benjamin followed Abidemi to the taxi man's place. He hid behind a pile of old tires and watched as they passed around the funny-smelling cigarettes. Abidemi took a puff, coughing at first, then laughing along with the others. Benjamin felt like screaming at him, "Stop it, don't do this!" But he was too scared. He just sat there, tears streaming down his face, feeling helpless. Things took a turn for the worse when Abidemi came home late one night, muttering to himself. He looked at Benjamin with wild eyes and said, "They're everywhere. You don't see them, but I do." Benjamin didn't know who they were, but it frightened him. Abidemi started pacing the room, talking about shadows and voices. Benjamin tried to calm him down, but Abidemi wouldn't listen. The next day, Abidemi didn't go to his apprenticeship. He just sat by the window, staring outside like he was waiting for something. Benjamin asked him if he was okay, but he didn't answer. That night, Benjamin heard him leave the house. He followed him as far as he could, but Abidemi walked too fast. He disappeared into the dark and Benjamin didn't see him until the next morning. When Abidemi came back, he looked tired and scared. "Don't tell anyone," he whispered. "They'll come for me if you do." Benjamin didn't know who they were, but he promised not to say anything. He just wanted his brother back. The quiet, kind boy who used to protect him from the world. But it felt like Abidemi was slipping further and further away, and there was nothing Benjamin could do to stop it. Benjamin started praying every night, asking God to help his brother. He didn't understand much about prayer, but he hoped someone up there was listening. Abidemi was all Benjamin had, and he couldn't bear to lose him. Even as things got darker, Benjamin held on to a small spark of hope, believing that somehow they'd find a way out of this nightmare. Benjamin didn't think he'd ever forget the day everything went wrong. It started like any other day, with Abidemi waking up early and fetching water. He didn't say much, as usual, but Benjamin could tell something was different. Abidemi's eyes looked heavy, like he hadn't slept all night, and he moved slower than normal. Benjamin wanted to ask if he was okay, but he was scared Abidemi would get annoyed, so he kept quiet. After Abidemi left for work, Benjamin spent most of the day trying to avoid their stepmother. She had this way of making you feel small, like you didn't belong in the house. Benjamin hated her so much, especially because of the way she treated Abidemi. She'd cook big pots of food for her children, and they weren't even allowed to touch the scraps. That afternoon, Benjamin saw her laughing with her kids in the kitchen. She had made jollof rice with chicken, and the smell filled the whole house. Benjamin's stomach growled loudly, and he tried to sneak past them to get a drink of water, but she caught him. "What are you doing here?" she barked. He froze, staring at her, too scared to speak. "Get out!" she yelled, grabbing a broom and swinging it at him. Benjamin ran as fast as he could, his heart pounding in his chest. He ended up hiding behind the old mango tree in the backyard, crying and wishing their mother had taken them with her when she left. When Abidemi came home that evening, Benjamin could tell something was wrong. He looked different. His clothes were dirty and his hands were shaking. He didn't go inside the house right away. Instead, he sat on the front steps, staring at the ground. "Are you okay?" Benjamin asked, sitting next to him. Abidemi didn't answer at first, but after a while he said, "I'm tired." "Tired of what?" Benjamin asked. "Everything," he whispered. Benjamin didn't know what to say. He wanted to hug him, to tell him everything would be okay, but he didn't know if that was true. Later that night, things got even worse. Abidemi had been spending a lot of time with the taxi man and his friends, and Benjamin feared they had a bad influence on him. Abidemi started talking to himself more and more, saying things that didn't make sense. He'd talk about people watching him, about shadows that weren't there. That night, Abidemi left the house again, just like he'd done before. Benjamin tried to follow him, but he told him to stay behind. "It's not safe," he said, and then he was gone. Benjamin sat by the window, waiting for him to come back, but he didn't. The next morning, their stepmother was in a bad mood. She started yelling at Benjamin for no reason, saying he was lazy and useless. He wanted to yell back, to tell her she was the useless one, but he was too scared. He just stood there, taking her insults, wishing Abidemi would come back and protect him like he used to. When Abidemi finally came home, it was clear something was very wrong. His eyes were red and he was sweating even though it wasn't hot outside. He was talking to himself again, mumbling things Benjamin couldn't understand. Their stepmother saw him and started yelling, calling him all sorts of terrible names. "You're a disgrace," she shouted. "Get out of my house." Their father just sat there, watching, not saying anything. It was like he didn't care what happened to them. Abidemi didn't argue. He just walked out of the house, his head hanging low. Benjamin ran after him, tears streaming down his face. "Where are you going?" he cried. "I don't know," Abidemi said. "But I can't stay here." Benjamin wanted to go with him, but Abidemi told him to stay. "You're too young for this," he said. "Just stay out of trouble." That was the last time Benjamin saw him for a long time. Days turned into weeks, and Abidemi didn't come home. Benjamin asked around, but no one seemed to know where he was. Some people said they saw him wandering the streets, talking to himself. Others said he was hanging out with the taxi man and his friends, smoking those funny cigarettes. Benjamin missed Abidemi so much it hurt. Every night he prayed for him to come back, for things to go back to the way they were before. But deep down, Benjamin knew things would never be the same. Abidemi was gone, and Benjamin didn't know if he'd ever come back. And so it was just Benjamin now, left to face the wrath of his stepmother and the cold indifference of his father. He felt so alone, like he was trapped in a nightmare he couldn't wake up from. But he held on to one small hope, that one day Abidemi would come back and they'd find a way to escape this terrible life together. Benjamin didn't know things could get worse after Abidemi left, but they did. Days felt like years, and every night he'd cry himself to sleep. His stepmother got meaner, like she was happy Abidemi wasn't around anymore. She made him do all the chores, washing plates, sweeping, fetching water, and if he made even a tiny mistake, she'd scream at him or hit him with whatever she could find. His father didn't say anything. He never did. He just sat in his chair, reading the newspaper or talking to his new wife. Benjamin wanted to yell at him, to ask why he hated him so much, but he couldn't. He was too scared. One evening, Benjamin was sitting under the mango tree, trying to finish his homework with the little light left from the setting sun. His stomach was growling because he hadn't eaten all day. His stepmother said he didn't deserve food because he didn't scrub the bathroom floor properly. As he tried to focus on his math problems, he heard footsteps coming down the road. He looked up and saw Abidemi. At first he was so happy he wanted to run to him and hug him. But then he saw Abidemi's face and his heart sank. Abidemi's clothes were dirty and his eyes looked wild, like he hadn't slept in days. He was mumbling to himself and his hands were shaking. "Abidemi!" Benjamin shouted, running toward him. Abidemi looked at him, but didn't say anything. His eyes were distant, like he was looking at something far away. "Are you okay?" Benjamin asked, grabbing Abidemi's arm. "I'm fine," Abidemi said, but his voice didn't sound fine. It was shaky and low, like he was trying to hold back tears. Benjamin led him to the backyard and gave him some water. Abidemi drank it quickly, like he hadn't had anything to drink in days. "You shouldn't be here," Benjamin whispered. "Stepma will be so angry if she sees you." "I don't care," Abidemi said. "I just wanted to see you." They sat under the mango tree for a while, talking quietly. Abidemi told him about how he'd been living on the streets doing odd jobs to survive. "It's not easy," he said, "but at least I'm free from her." Benjamin wanted to tell Abidemi to stay, to hide in the house where no one would find him, but he knew it wasn't safe. His stepmother would make Abidemi's life even worse if she found out he was back. Just as they were talking, they heard loud voices coming from the front of the house. "Police!" someone shouted. Benjamin froze. Abidemi's eyes widened, and he jumped to his feet. "I have to go," he said. Before Benjamin could say anything, Abidemi took off, running toward the back fence. Benjamin tried to follow him, but Abidemi was too fast. The police came into the yard, shining their flashlights everywhere. One of them grabbed Benjamin by the arm. "Where is he?" the officer asked. "I don't know," Benjamin said, his voice trembling. The officers didn't believe him. They searched the whole yard, turning over buckets and opening the chicken coop. His stepmother came outside, pretending to be so innocent. "What's going on?" she asked in her fake sweet voice. "We're looking for a boy," the officer said. "We heard he's been causing trouble in the area." His stepmother acted like she didn't know anything, but Benjamin could tell she was enjoying this. She even said, "If I see him, I'll let you know." After the police left, Benjamin went back to the mango tree and sat there, crying. He felt so helpless. He wanted to help Abidemi, to protect him, but he didn't know how. That night, Benjamin prayed harder than he ever had before. He asked God to keep Abidemi safe, to bring him back home so they could be together again. But deep down, he was scared. What if Abidemi never came back? What if the police caught him? Or something worse happened? The next morning, Benjamin found out the police had shot someone during their patrol. His heart stopped when he heard the news. Was it Abidemi? He ran to the spot where it happened, but there was no one there. Some neighbors said the person had been taken to the hospital, but no one knew who it was. Benjamin spent the whole day searching, asking anyone who would listen if they'd seen Abidemi. By the time he got home, it was dark, and he was exhausted. His stepmother yelled at him for being late, but he didn't care. All he could think about was Abidemi. Days turned into weeks, and Benjamin didn't hear anything. It was like Abidemi had disappeared. Every night he'd sit by the window, hoping Abidemi would come back. He'd imagine him walking up the road, smiling and waving like he used to. But he never did. Even now, Benjamin still thinks about Abidemi. He wonders where he is, if he's okay, if he even remembers him. Sometimes, Benjamin likes to think Abidemi is out there somewhere, living a better life. But other times, he's scared Abidemi's gone forever, lost in a world that never cared about them. And so, Benjamin waits. Because that's all he can do. Wait and hope that one day, Abidemi will come back, and they can finally be a family again. The days after Abidemi's disappearance felt like a big, empty hole inside Benjamin. He couldn't stop thinking about him. Every time he sat under the mango tree, he'd imagine Abidemi sitting there with him, telling stories about his work or laughing at one of Benjamin's silly jokes. But Abidemi wasn't there anymore, and everything felt wrong. His stepmother acted like nothing happened. She went on with her day, cooking for her children, laughing loudly, and ignoring Benjamin completely unless she needed something done. His father didn't say a word about Abidemi either. He just sat in his chair, like always, reading his newspaper or talking about things that didn't matter. It made Benjamin so angry. How could they not care? How could they just forget about Abidemi like he didn't exist? Benjamin started searching for Abidemi in secret. Every afternoon after school, he'd wander around the neighborhood, asking anyone he saw if they'd seen him. Most people shook their heads and said no, but a few told Benjamin stories. "Your brother?" one man said, scratching his beard. "Oh, I saw someone like that a few days ago. He was sitting by the bus stop talking to himself." Another woman told Benjamin, "I think I saw him at the market, helping a trader carry her goods. He looked thin though. Are you sure he's okay?" These little bits of information gave Benjamin hope, but they also scared him. Was Abidemi okay? Was he eating? Did he have a place to sleep at night? The thought of him being out there, all alone, made Benjamin's chest hurt. One evening, Benjamin decided to follow a lead from a neighbor. They said they saw someone who looked like Abidemi near the old train station. The place was far from home, and Benjamin knew he'd get in trouble if he was caught, but he didn't care. He had to find Abidemi. He walked for what felt like hours, his feet hurting and his stomach growling. The sun was setting and the sky turned orange and pink. By the time Benjamin reached the train station, it was almost dark. The place was quiet, except for the sound of crickets and the occasional hoot of an owl. Benjamin called out, "Brother? Are you here?" His voice echoed, bouncing off the empty walls. At first, there was no answer, but then he heard something, a faint mumbling coming from the corner of the station. He ran toward the sound, his heart pounding. There he was, Abidemi. He was sitting on the ground, leaning against the wall. His clothes were torn and his hair was messy, but it was him. "Brother!" Benjamin shouted, running to him. Abidemi looked up, his eyes wide with surprise. For a moment, Benjamin thought he didn't recognize him. But then Abidemi smiled, a small, tired smile, and said, "You found me." Benjamin hugged him tightly, tears streaming down his face. "I missed you so much," he said. "Why did you leave?" Abidemi didn't answer right away. Instead, he looked at the ground, his hands trembling. "I didn't want to," he said finally. "But I didn't have a choice. They don't want me there. They don't matter," Benjamin said fiercely. "You're my brother, and I want you with me." Abidemi smiled again, but it didn't reach his eyes. "It's not that simple," he said. Benjamin didn't understand what he meant, but he didn't care. He told Abidemi he'd take him home, that they'd figure everything out together. But Abidemi shook his head. "I can't go back," Abidemi said. "It's better this way." Benjamin wanted to argue, to beg him to come with him, but he could see in Abidemi's eyes that he wouldn't change his mind. So instead, Benjamin stayed with him, sitting by his side as the night grew darker, as they talked about little things, about the mango tree, about school, about how much Benjamin missed him. When it was time to leave, Benjamin promised him he'd come back. "I'll bring you food," he said, "and clothes, whatever you need." Abidemi nodded, but Benjamin could tell he didn't believe him. As Benjamin walked back home that night, he felt a strange mix of happiness and sadness. He was happy he'd found Abidemi, but he was scared he'd lose him again. He didn't know what the future held. But he knew one thing for sure. He'd do whatever it took to keep his brother safe. Because no matter what, Abidemi was his brother, and he loved him more than anything in the world. The next day, Benjamin woke up before the sun, his heart beating fast like a drum. He didn't even eat breakfast. He couldn't. All he could think about was Abidemi sitting alone at the train station, looking so tired and sad. He had to help him, no matter what. First, Benjamin went to the kitchen to see if he could find any food to take to Abidemi. His stepmother was busy making breakfast for her children, laughing loudly like she always did. She didn't even notice when Benjamin snuck a few pieces of bread and some boiled yams into a bag. His heart was pounding so hard he thought she might hear it, but she just kept talking and laughing, not paying any attention to him. With the bag of food hidden under his shirt, Benjamin headed out. He told his father he was going to school early to study. His father didn't care, as usual. That was fine with Benjamin. He didn't want him asking questions anyway. The walk to the train station felt longer than it did the night before. The sun was already hot, and sweat dripped down Benjamin's face, but he didn't stop. He kept imagining Abidemi's face when he saw the food, how his eyes would light up and he'd finally smile for real. When Benjamin got to the train station, it was quieter than ever. The only sounds were the birds chirping and the rustling of leaves in the wind. "Brother!" he called out, running toward the corner where he'd found Abidemi before. Abidemi wasn't there. "Brother!" Benjamin called again, louder this time. His voice echoed in the empty station. His heart started racing. What if Abidemi had left? What if something bad had happened to him? Just as Benjamin was about to panic, he heard a faint noise, something from behind an old bench. He ran toward the sound, and there he was, Abidemi, lying on the ground with his arms covering his face. "Brother, I brought you food," Benjamin said, holding up the bag. Abidemi sat up slowly, his eyes squinting in the sunlight. "You came back?" he said, his voice soft and surprised. "Of course I did," Benjamin said, handing him the bag. "I told you I'd help you." Abidemi opened the bag and stared at the food for a moment before taking a piece of bread. He ate it slowly, like he didn't believe it was real. Watching him made Benjamin feel both happy and sad. Happy because he was eating, but sad because he looked so tired and thin. "Why don't you come home with me?" Benjamin asked again. Abidemi shook his head. "I can't," he said. "They don't want me there. They don't matter," Benjamin said, his voice shaking. "You're my brother, and you belong with me." Abidemi didn't say anything, just kept eating in silence. Benjamin sat beside him, his heart heavy. He didn't know how to make him see that he deserved better, that he wasn't alone. After a while, Abidemi looked at Benjamin and said, "You're a good kid, you know that?" Benjamin blinked back tears. "You're my brother. I'd do anything for you." That day, Benjamin made a promise to himself. If his brother wouldn't come home, he'd bring home to him. Every day after school, he'd bring him food, clothes, or anything else he needed. He'd keep him company, make him laugh, and remind him that he wasn't alone. For weeks, Benjamin kept his promise. He'd sneak food from the kitchen, borrow clothes from neighbors, and spend every spare moment at the train station with Abidemi. They'd sit together, talking about everything and nothing. Abidemi would tell him stories about his work, about the people he met, and about the dreams he used to have. But things weren't always easy. Benjamin's stepmother started noticing the missing food, and his father began asking why he was always leaving so early and coming back so late. Benjamin had to come up with excuses, like saying he was studying or helping a friend. It wasn't easy, but he didn't care. Abidemi was worth it. One day, when Benjamin brought Abidemi some old clothes he'd borrowed, Abidemi looked at him with tears in his eyes. "You're doing all this for me?" he asked. "Because you're my brother," Benjamin said simply. "And I love you." Abidemi hugged him then, for the first time in what felt like forever. It was a tight, warm hug that made Benjamin feel like everything would be okay. But deep down, Benjamin knew it wouldn't be that simple. Abidemi was still hurting, still lost in a world that didn't seem to care about him. And no matter how hard Benjamin tried, he couldn't fix everything. Still, he wasn't going to give up. He'd keep fighting for Abidemi, keep loving him, and keep reminding him that he wasn't alone. Because that's what brothers do. And no matter what, Benjamin would always be there for him. It was a Saturday, and Saturdays were always Benjamin's favorite because he didn't have to go to school. It meant he could spend the whole day with Abidemi at the train station. He woke up early, as usual, sneaking food and a blanket out of the house. The morning air was cool, and the streets were quiet as he walked to the station, excited to see his brother. But when he got there, something felt different. The bench where Abidemi usually sat was empty. Benjamin's heart started to race. He called out for him, running to all the corners where Abidemi sometimes hid when he wanted to be alone. "Brother, where are you?" He searched and searched, but Abidemi wasn't there. His legs felt weak and he sat down on the dusty ground, holding the food bag tightly. Tears pricked his eyes. Had Abidemi left? Had something bad happened to him? Then, out of nowhere, Benjamin heard a voice behind him. "Looking for someone?" He turned around so fast he almost fell over. It was one of the taxi drivers Abidemi used to help. The man was holding a cigarette and looking at Benjamin with tired eyes. "My brother," Benjamin said quickly. "Have you seen him?" The man nodded slowly. "Saw him last night," he said. "He was talking to some church people. They said they wanted to help him." "Church people?" Benjamin repeated, his heart leaping. Maybe they were the answer to all their prayers. "Where did they take him?" The man pointed down the road. "Big white building with a cross on it," he said. He didn't want to go, but they convinced him. Benjamin didn't even wait to say thank you. He ran as fast as his legs could carry him, the bag bouncing against his side. The white church wasn't far, but it felt like it took forever to get there. His chest burned and his feet hurt, but he didn't stop. When he finally reached the church, he saw Abidemi sitting on the steps, his head down. A man in a white shirt and tie was talking to him softly, holding a Bible. Abidemi looked different, calmer somehow. "Brother!" Benjamin shouted, running toward him. Abidemi looked up, and for the first time in a long time, Benjamin saw something in his eyes that he hadn't seen before. Hope. "You came," Abidemi said, standing up as Benjamin reached him. "Of course I did," Benjamin said, out of breath. "What's going on? Are they helping you?" The man with the Bible smiled at Benjamin. "Your brother is very lucky to have someone like you," he said. "We're going to help him get back on his feet. No more streets, no more hunger." Benjamin didn't know what to say. His chest felt tight, and tears started rolling down his face. "You mean, he's going to be okay?" The man nodded. "It'll take time, but yes, with God's help he'll be okay." Abidemi put a hand on Benjamin's shoulder. "I'm sorry," he said quietly, "for everything, for worrying you, for making you cry. I promise I'll try to get better." Benjamin hugged him tightly, not caring who was watching. "You don't have to say sorry," he said. "I just want you to be happy." The church people took them inside and gave them food. They let them sit in a small room where it was quiet and warm. Abidemi told Benjamin he was going to stay there for a while, that they were going to help him find a job and a place to live. Benjamin didn't want to leave him, but he knew Abidemi was in good hands. As he walked back home that evening, the sunset painting the sky in orange and pink, he felt something he hadn't felt in a long time. Peace. When he got home, his stepmother asked where he had been, but Benjamin didn't care what she thought. His father didn't even look up from his chair. For the first time, it didn't bother him. He knew Abidemi was safe, and that was all that mattered. Weeks turned into months, and Abidemi started to change. He looked healthier, smiled more, and even started going to church regularly. He got a small job fixing chairs, and he told Benjamin he was saving up to rent a tiny apartment. One day, Abidemi came to Benjamin's school to visit him. He brought him a new school bag and a pair of shiny black shoes. "You deserve the best," he said, smiling. Benjamin couldn't stop grinning. "You're the best brother in the world," he said. Life wasn't perfect after that, but it was better. His stepmother and father still didn't change, but Benjamin didn't care as much. He and Abidemi had each other, and that was enough. Looking back now, Benjamin realizes how strong Abidemi was. He went through so much, but he never gave up. And because of him, Benjamin learned how to be strong too. Sometimes when things get tough, Benjamin thinks about those days at the train station. He remembers how Abidemi would look at him and say, "We'll be okay." And you know what? He was right. They were okay. They are okay. And they'll keep being okay no matter what. This story has come to an end. If you enjoyed it, please type yes in the comments section and click the like button so that others can see this video. If you are new to this channel, don't forget to subscribe for part 2 of this video. Stay safe and have a good day.